I've been covering a little bit of Azure OpenAI, or the integration of large language models to your common use cases. Azure Foundry specifically is where I'm more specialized in. And Microsoft has announced the use of Azure OpenAI Response API. Now, if you've been using the OpenAI's API for quite some time, you likely are familiar with chat completions or assistance if you're running something a little bit more stateful. So really the modernization of that is using the Response API. So on the right-hand side that you see here that I point out is essentially the output of the new API. So you can see there's quite a few things. You have your ID, your object, any instructions. Now think of instructions more of system prompting or directing your large language model to a specific objective, the output, things of that nature. And then now you'll see here you're assigned essentially a message ID or a response ID. Now the great thing about this is it becomes stateful in nature. So unlike chat completions, when you're done with that conversation, it's essentially stateless. It would have to be retrieved or stored in some type of memory, if you will. These will essentially stay stored. I believe the retention is 30 days. You can obviously delete these in a queue if you want as well. So just at a high level, what are the models that are supported as of today? You'll see GPT-4o, these specific API versions, computer use and preview. So if you want to use computer use where it takes over essentially your computer to go through specific motions that you've seen in demos, things like that, there is a specific private preview or preview that you'd have to get accepted into to use. But if you can see, it's kind of rolling out across all the models, Nano, Mini. And then I'm obviously using a little bit older at this point, GPT-4o Mini from the example I'm going to use. So just wanted to cover this at a high level before I go into some of the code details. Now, I will say the documentation's a little muddy, so if you run into issues, what I found, at least from my perspective, is the OpenAI reference, if you will, outlines quite a lot more that is not always covered with the specific Azure responses. So for an example here, this will tell you all the inclusions of the SDK. Essentially, it's a wrapper of that SDK. So you can see here it has computer call output if you're using computer call, or code interpreter call as a tool, if you will. And you can include these. They'll tell you it's an array or null, and it's optional from that perspective. So if you run into issues, just something to be aware of. I had to correct some of the code from the documentation. So switching over to Visual Studio Code, you'll see here I ran some code. I essentially ran a test and I got assigned a specific ID. Now I'm going to go through more of a little bit more complex code, if you will. So I have a couple files. I have one that is system. Now the system.txt is essentially the direction. Think of that as the system prompt, if you will. Now we're going to be able to use this in the Response API. So you can see here I have it in a markdown type of format, txt, okay, very generic. Identity, your financial advisor, extensive experience. Think of this as I'm directing the model to what I want out of it, right? And then I'm saying with the instructions, okay, based on your persona, when you present any advice, give it clear, concise, as end user might not have a financial background, explain topics such as how expense ratios can add up over a period of time. And ideally, you just want to think of whatever your use case is, you want to be very specific, and it has to be measurable in the perspective what the end user gets back. So the more specific, the better in this perspective. So now I give some basic examples what the model should encounter, right? So user query, what ETFs are widely diversified in a low expense ratio, given the macroeconomic environment factors that can provide an aggressive mix of international and domestic US returns, right? So then I also have what I expect a response should look at. Based on the contextual factors provided by the query itself. Now, long story short, I've ran some demos before with agents showing what this looks like. So just to walk you through the code here, fairly straightforward. I'm loading the environment variables. Now I'm essentially opening that system.txt read. I have that file read. And then I'm passing that system prompt as it's read, stored right in the system prompt. Now you'll see here I initiate similar to what we use with Azure OpenAI. So I'll import through the SDK of OpenAI. Now it's clear that you want to put a specific API version as preview here. Let me see if I can zoom in here. So you want this to say preview for it to run, okay? Now you'll see here where I have initial response as far as the client. Now this is me chaining the responses together, similar to LangChain. So I'm taking one response, based on that output, I'm sending that to the second one. So I simply put, I'm considering diversifying holdings of 90% US equities. I give it a ticker symbol, and I want 5% VXUS as a ticker symbol and 5% VNQ, which is a real estate investment trust. I'm considering this over a specific time period, right? Time horizon, 10 years. And I want this in a tax advantage Roth IRA. I plan to add the maximum available every year given this 10-year horizon, plus using DRIP. If you don't know what DRIP is, essentially you get paid a dividend for holding a specific, either an individual stock, an ETF, etc. You essentially have a automated reinvestment of that specific amount back into your portfolio. But over time, that could also increase your taxes too. So things you want to be aware of, right? Now, again, I always say this is a large language model, so don't take everything too literal here. Just giving some examples of how I would use this together. So that now I have this spread out to the first input going to the second response. Now, for the second one, I pass in the prompt being the previous response, taking that previous response ID. And then I put the input saying, okay, explain this response in detail using this previous response, include the reasoning behind each suggestion, how it aligns with the investment strategy. So I say a little bit more a tinkering with being specific. And then I highlight specifically, okay, what's the initial response? And then what's the second response? So let me switch over here. Let me zoom out. So you'll see here I have it printed out as the initial response when I ran that code. Now it's saying your proposed allocation. All right, it gives me a breakdown, just a high level overview, and then the investment advice of those three funds specifically. Now it gives a little bit of background. Okay, is a great choice for US equities, broad exposure, entire US market, large, mid, and small. So that covers essentially my 90% equities that I'd like, right? And then I am concerned with the international environment. So I also have VXUS for that diversification. And then I also have a small holding of real estate. Now this would be representative of aggressive from that perspective. So you can see here, giving your allocation, what this would look like, assuming, let's say you start with 10,000 for that example. So with that contribution, what does that really break down to? So 10,000, 90% of that, simple from that perspective. Now, what are the tax implications? So this will tell you specifically based on the tax advantage account, what does that look like over time? Given your focus on DRIP, this will compound your growth without your tax drag. So over time, ideally, if you're not from the US, this is a shield over your account so that reinvestment itself is still earning more money throughout your period of time, tax-free from that perspective. So it's not gonna hurt you come tax season. Now, this will also talk about the annual contribution limits. It looks like it's pulled this from 2023. Looks fairly accurate. I believe it's a little higher. I think it's 7,000 now from that perspective. And then this will give you additional considerations and a example of an expense ratio over time. Now, the reason I call this out specifically is because every investment has some type of expense, whether it's managed, especially in ETF, very low from that perspective. I am very familiar with the REIT investment VNQ, so I can see specifically 0.12 is called out there, but just to give you that example there. Now, this was the initial response, okay? So now we take that initial response, we pass that in the second response. Now, this will ideally simplify it a little bit further. So you can see here, it's going to give more rationale, the reasoning, the alignment with your strategy, right? So this is a little bit more specific to the end goal. So if you didn't want to show, let's say an end user, the reasoning for the first response, you'll show them the second response and have it refined. And that's really the idea behind it. But you can see here with a short amount of code, there wasn't much that I had to provide to get that specific output. Now, really the key difference here is using preview. And if you see here, when I initiate the responses and I hit create, I have quite a lot of specific parameters that I can mess with. So I have truncation, I have user, extra headers, reasoning specifically. So if I'm using an O1 model or O3, things of that nature. It will also tell you how many tokens were used for reasoning tokens, parallel tool calls, things like that. So at a high level, at least wanted to show a preview from what is Response API. This is going to be more moving forward. I believe chat completions is still supported for quite some time, but if you wanted to modernize and unify what that looks like, if you're experimenting with computer use or other specific methods that chat completions might not have, this is a pretty unique type of experience because it does also have the ability to call the previous message as well. So if you've been around for quite some time with assistants, this was one of those things too. The assistants were essentially stateful where it's stored it. So it's trying to unify that experience. But otherwise, moving back to our specific visual, let me move around here. These regions as of today are supported. There's many more in here, but it's pretty widely available in preview. Now just note that these are the specific models. Obviously, if you're using Llama, Mistral, things of that nature outside of that OpenAI ecosystem, it's gonna look a little different because they're not representing that same SDK wrapper, if you will. But I imagine there's gonna be some type of either uniformity or something close to this output for other models as well through the Azure AI inference specific output. Outside of that, just wanted to cover what Response API is, how you can get up and running. The cookbook I'll always recommend specifically from Azure or from OpenAI will definitely get you up and running. And if there's any type of like input, so I can show you here, they'll have like an image input. So if I'm trying to scan a specific image, I can provide that URL. What does that input look like? File input, etc. They have pretty good code examples, and then it'll show you even what the response is supposed to look like on your end as well. So if you run into any issues and the Azure documentation doesn't cover that, feel free to check out the OpenAI documentation. I'll leave that in the specific video as well. So you'll see this mirrors some of this. Some of this might be specific to Azure. So just some things to call out from that perspective. Those are really those two different areas. So at a high level, that is the video for today. I will continue putting out some more content. I know it's been quite some time. Just wanted to get a video out there. Thank you for your time today.